Hello, everyone. We are going to give a little bit more time for people to log in. We will start the presentation in about 30 seconds.
All right, I see some familiar names in the people who are joining already. Thank you, everyone. Really looking forward to this chat with Ajay.
Yes. And hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Path to Becoming a CFO. I'm your host, Mackenzie Wright. And before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. All attendees are muted, and if you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A tab on your control bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for me, please send them directly to me and I can coordinate the answer. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session, so I encourage you to submit them. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can, but if we can't, we will follow up following the presentation. A little bit about Airbase. We are the leading spend management platform. It combines an comprehensive accounts payable and advanced corporate card program, employee expense reimbursements into one system. Airbase automates accounting and operational workflows for a faster close, real-time reporting, and a consistent platform experience for all non-payroll spend. Our team has created a vast array of content to help you at any point in your journey to becoming a CFO. One popular resource is our Offer Letter Slack community. You can connect with close to 4,000 other finance professionals. Even our own team members can't get in since we keep it sales and marketing free. We also have other upcoming events, including a few of our other webinar series, Path to Becoming a CFO, What I Wish I Knew, and 20-minute tales from finance leaders. Or you can find us live and in person at upcoming events like Sweet World, Sage Transform, AFP, and QuickBooks Connect. And we'd love to see you there. All of these resources can be found at airbase.com, but to make it easy, I'll also share them in the Zoom chat window following this. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our guest moderator, Airbase co-founder and CEO, Thejo Kote. He founded Airbase in 2017, and this is his second US venture-backed company. The first Automatic was acquired by SiriusXM. So without further ado, Thejo, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Mackenzie. I became the guest moderator, which it kind of sucks. I know for those of you who have been keeping track, Jeff Epstein has been doing a bunch of these sessions, and I get the pleasure of interviewing Ajay today, and Ajay, is now a general partner at IVP, a well-known growth venture capital firm. Before this, he was the CFO at Dropbox, where he had a meteoric rise. He started his career as an analyst at Morgan Stanley, then joined NEA. As a more junior investor, then went to Dropbox, and he was an investor in Dropbox. Then he spent the last 4 years of his tenure at Dropbox as its CFO, right? So he's had kind of a fantastic career at a very young age, and I'm looking forward to kind of diving into all the lessons that all of us can take away from his experience. So Ajay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start off. There's so much we're going to dig into, but I'm going to start off with a little bit of drama, right? And I remember you were telling me about this massive turning point in Dropbox's kind of history as a business, a huge decision. You were kind of championing this effort to go spend $400 million, which is kind of unprecedented for technology company to go kind of make that kind of big outlay of spend. Very rare. You were championing it for all the right reasons. And the board basically said, you know what? We're going to make you the CFO to go make sure you don't screw this up, right? And I'm sure I'm simplifying this at some level, but that was kind of a fascinating kind of a story for me to hear. And I would love for you to dive into the how of it, the why of it, and the impact that had on the business.
Yes. That was definitely an interesting time in Dropbox's journey. And we had a mission statement as a finance organization at Dropbox of continuous improvement and strategic disruption. And so every year we had a set of OKRs that we would publish around ways that we wanted to improve how we manage the day-to-day operations of a finance organization and ways that we wanted to have a more strategic impact on the business. So what are ways that we could help to inflect our growth trajectory? What are ways that we could help to realize our full potential, to generate more efficiency so we could turn around and spend some of those savings on product investment? And the next big thing that we wanted to work on and launch as a company Act Two. And in the spirit of that latter category of strategic kind of disruptions that we were focused on as an organization, we saw a lot of potential, I would say relatively early on in the company's journey, to improve our unit economics, to lower our unit costs by moving off of the public cloud onto our own internal custom-built infrastructure. So just by way of background, most companies tend to move in the opposite direction. So they very quickly and early on will adopt AWS or Azure or GCP, and having a public cloud infrastructure that they're leveraging allows them to scale up really quickly because they're not having to manage all the capital expenditures in their own data center or server footprint. We scaled in the same way. So Dropbox was initially scaled on the back of AWS, and AWS was a fantastic partner to the company for many, many years, still is for certain storage and compute workloads that Dropbox needs and leverages. But we got to a certain scale as a company that was storing exabytes of data for hundreds of millions of users all around the world, where we had the opportunity to, and we ultimately could custom engineer and tailor a lot of our storage and compute flows in a way that allowed us to realize some pretty material cost savings. So we had a multi-month partnership between the finance organization and our infrastructure organization, which was just an incredibly strong team at Dropbox, just to understand how this kind of a migration could work. How could we migrate off of Amazon to our own servers and data centers, and the investment it would take, how long it would take, the complexity of that kind of an effort. And what we ultimately mapped out was almost a 4-year process where we'd have to run 2 sets of infrastructure in parallel. We'd have to be storing every byte of data that Dropbox users were adding to our platform on AWS, and then we'd have to mirror that data on our own internal custom-built infrastructure. And we'd have to do that over time as that data volume grew, and we started to migrate until we felt comfortable turning AWS off and just relying solely on our own infrastructure. So long story short, 4 years, about $400 million in capital investment is what we scoped, but a project that would allow us to materially improve our unit costs and to materially improve our gross margins. Before we started the migration, our gross margins hovered in the zip code of about 42%. That's where gross margins were pre-migration. And as we worked through the migration, they stayed pretty low because, again, we were maintaining 2 different sets of infrastructure. And then as we started to delete data off of AWS and really solely manage data ourselves, gross margins ultimately grew to about 80%. So we effectively doubled our gross margins as a result of this project. But as you noted, some of the drama around this was, as a private growth stage startup, to turn around and spend $400 million in CapEx, it was a very big check that raised a lot of eyebrows, I would say, internally and with the board. But it's one that we ultimately got buy-in for. And that was a project that we helped to champion before I became CFO. Actually, it was on the path to becoming CFO of the company, but one that really paid off in spades and set the company up for, I think, a lot of success as it related to our IPO and our ability to reinvest in the business going forward.
Got it. That's amazing. So, very pivotal moment, I guess, in Dropbox's history and in your career. And so let's step back a bit now, right? So tell us a bit about where you grew up, the family background at a high level, and as you were growing up, did you see, where you are today, and was that kind of were you the ambitious kid who set goals for yourself? I'd love to start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I did not see myself ending up in the roles and on the career path that I ultimately did end up in. I wasn't really sure what path I would take in life. I grew up in the Northwest, and I grew up just outside of Seattle in 2 towns. First half of my childhood, Redmond, Washington, which is where Microsoft is headquartered, and my dad worked for Microsoft when I was growing up, so I had some exposure to the world of tech. And then second half of my childhood on a small island called Mercer Island, which is near Seattle in Lake Washington. And the reason I'm mentioning that specifically is because there's an interesting cloud storage wars story I can tell you in a moment about Dropbox and Box and the history around Mercer Island. But Redmond and Mercer Island, my dad worked in tech. My mom was a CPA growing up. And so there was and now in retrospect, in hindsight, there was the foundation of software and tech and finance. And it's kind of funny how that all came together for me career-wise. Then I went out to school in the Northeast in New York City. After graduating from undergrad, I joined Morgan Stanley, and I did not join the tech group at Morgan Stanley. I joined the power and utilities group in the investment banking division. And so we all worked on similar projects and deals across different industry groups, but most people that are working in tech today, I would say, got their, who came from the world of banking, got their start in the tech group or tech M&A group. But the power and utilities group had a great reputation for how they cultivated more junior talent and invested in more junior talent. And so culturally, it was actually a really rewarding place to spend time in the world of investment banking, which can be a very punishing place for many folks that go through those kinds of programs. But I had a great time in that group, and then got to work on a number of clean tech deals. There was I would say clean tech boom number one started to really come together around the time that I was at Morgan Stanley. I think we're on the cusp of climate tech boom number two, or clean tech boom number two. That's probably imminent. I worked on clean tech and then initially moved to the West Coast and joined a venture firm, NEA, to focus on clean tech investing, clean tech venture investing. And so as a young associate at NEA, that was my initial focus. So think solar, wind, energy technology, like energy storage and efficiency kind of investments and deals. It was not a great model for venture at the time because it was relatively capital intensive, and there were long timelines to liquidity, and it was venture risk with more capital intensity than the venture model was really set up for at the time. But I was at a very large generalist fund, NEA, and so another category that we invested in pretty actively was the world of software and SaaS. And so very early on in my tenure at NEA as an associate, I got to work on some really cool software deals, like our investments in Tableau and Workday, and that piqued my interest in the world of software. And I was having a great time investing and loved what I was doing and had no intention of really leaving the world of venture. And then the opportunity to join Dropbox relatively early in the company's journey came up, and it just felt like an incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The company was doing extraordinarily well and really inflecting growth. And the company was small from a headcount perspective. There were about 100 employees at Dropbox at the time that I joined. Really, like, not many people at all in the world of business and finance. And so I was one of the first hires into that organization. And so it was, the role itself was, it wasn't, it was relatively unscoped. It was, hey, come in and help us build the infrastructure for the finance and for parts of the business organization. And we know you haven't done it before, but enough people at the company know you, and we're going to trust you and hand you the keys to do that. And so Dropbox, and this is where I can tell maybe briefly the cloud storage war story. So Dropbox was actually not an NEA investment at the time, but Box, which was a competitor and is still in some ways a competitor, although less and less so, to Dropbox. Box was an investment for NEA. So I mentioned I grew up on Mercer Island. The founders of Box also grew up on Mercer Island. We all played tennis together on the high school tennis team. And so we knew each other pretty well. And so when I was at NEA, we invested in Box, and then I ultimately joined Dropbox. And so then it became this rivalry that started in high school and went all the way to the world of Silicon Valley. But again, 100 people, about 45 million in revenue was the scale of the company when I joined. No infrastructure on the finance side, very little on the business side. And it was really, my initial mandate was to help build out that organization. So accounting, FP&A, tax, treasury, real estate, workplace, those were all parts of the org that I got to help us set the foundation for. And so make that first hire into those organizations, help build and scale them. And as I focused on each one, I would move on to the next. And there's so much that I learned and absorbed doing that about the world of finance and the operating world. It was an incredible experience. I did that for a few years. And then I stepped into a role overseeing corp dev and M&A at Dropbox. And I would say we were a relatively acquisitive company. So we acquired about 30 companies when I was at Dropbox. The majority of those were talent acquisitions. So bringing really talented engineers, PMs, designers into the organization. But then a number of product acquisitions and business acquisitions as well. And so I did that for almost 2 years, and then stepped into the CFO role about 4 years into my journey at Dropbox. So that's the quick background up until becoming CFO.
That's fascinating. So I want to dig into one choice that you had to make, which was kind of super important early in your career as an investor in NEA, right? And you had this choice of continuing to go down this path as a venture capitalist, and you were doing the apprentice job, if I'm not mistaken, and then you would have had the opportunity to grow into the bigger roles over time, or you could go be an operator, right? So you could go dive in, help build a business. What was your thought process when you were thinking about the trade-offs and the ultimately you made the choice to go be an operator, but how were you thinking about that choice, and why did you ultimately land on the side of wanting to go help build a company?
Sure, it's a great question. I would say for a couple different reasons. One, looking around the table as an investor at NEA, a lot of the folks, the really talented investors that I got to work with at NEA and at other venture funds that we co-invested with, were people that had helped to build and scale enduring companies, enduring tech companies themselves. And there was just a lot of credibility, but more importantly, impact that came with that, with respect to the partnership they were in with founders and executive teams, the advice they were giving, the advice of consequence that they were giving, their engagement with these companies, and then their ability to get into the most competitive deals. And so a lot of the ingredients of success I saw were correlated with relevant experience, being on the other side of the table. And so it felt like if I was interested in building a longer career in investing, which I've always been interested in doing, and I'm back on that side of the table now, spending time, meaningful time in an operating role would be really important. So that was one reason. Two, it felt like there was just a tremendous amount to learn in the operating world, and a lot I didn't have context on. And there's so much exciting growth, as you know, being at Airbase, that happens when you're at a company like Dropbox early on, that was like a growth and learning that I wanted to experience and go through. So it was really those two reasons that I felt like, hey, I feel like if I want to really build a career as an investor, this may only be an accelerant to that. And it's experience that I want to bring to the partnerships that I have with companies.
So how did that conversation go when you said, hey, we have invested in Box, I'm going to leave and go join Dropbox?
That conversation, it wasn't the smoothest conversation in the world, to be honest. At the time, the team at Box was super understanding, and it was the rekindling of a fun rivalry between myself and Aaron and Dylan, who are the CEO and CFO of Box and the co-founders there. But it was also celebrated in that, hey, we were sending an associate at NEA to an incredible company that will hopefully achieve amazing things. And so I would say it was after the first 24 hours of shock, it was a relatively smooth transition after that.
Got it. And what is the mindset that you went into Dropbox with? Clearly, you did a lot. You're 100% company, and you talked about all these different functions that you helped set up. But did you go in with a particular mindset of this is what I'm trying to accomplish, or was the role defined well enough? And what was the mindset going in?
The role was not defined well, to be honest. And my mindset was one of an open mindset. So let me go in, understand how companies work from the inside and not just from the outside, which was my context before that, and see where I can be helpful, honestly. I had the benefit of knowing a few people at the company at the time, and I'd worked with them at different stages in my career, and I was relatively close to them. So that onboarding process was one that went relatively smoothly as a result. But it was a pretty open-ended role. And so like in my first few weeks and months at Dropbox, it involved everything from recruiting the first few hires into the finance organization to helping us sign a lease for more office space to launching a catering program for employees. So there was no job that couldn't get done by me and the organization, the early finance organization back in the day. But we really had to do a lot, to building our first company model in Excel, to managing a migration off of NetSuite off of QuickBooks onto NetSuite. And so it was kind of a crash course in everything finance. And we don't have enough hands on deck, and we have to get stuff done. So can you just run with this, run with that?
Got it. So was it a little bit of the age-old, when you're offered a seat on the rocket ship, don't ask which seat, just get on and figure it out?
It was a lot of that. In fact, I got that advice before I joined Dropbox from an investor that I worked with who said, hey, if you're offered a role, any kind of role at the company, if you're offered a role on the finance team, if you're offered a role on the workplace and facilities team, helping to clean up at night, at the end of the day, I would take it, because you're just going to absorb and learn so much. And once you're in the organization, if you're focused on having impact and you have it, then that your career path is going to really open up in a powerful way. So join at any level in any role you can was the advice I got when the Dropbox opportunity first presented itself.
Yeah, that is just incredible advice that thankfully I also got fairly early in my career, and hopefully something that folks who are listening in kind of take away as an important life lesson, right? And so let's fast forward a bit. You were doing all of these things all the way from janitor to head of FP&A and setting up all of these functions, in various areas of the company. And how did that CFO opportunity kind of fall into your lap? Talk us through a little bit of why did the board, and Dropbox was clearly on a trajectory to go public and be a public company, right? And why did the board and Drew, the CEO, feel, that they wanted to bet on you, and how did they think about the risk of doing so, the pros and the cons, and if you don't mind, walk us through how that played out.
It's a really good question. It's one I ask myself even today sometimes. Why was that bet made? We actually interviewed a lot of CFO candidates when I was at Dropbox, and I interviewed almost all of them myself as well when I was there. And I would say from the candidate pool that was available when we ran a few of our CFO searches, we couldn't find someone that had a great chemistry with the rest of our founders and the rest of our executive team. And we couldn't find someone that was focused on really having outsized disruptive impact in the CFO role. And I think the CFO role has changed so much over the last 10, 20 years, is continuing to change looking forward. And a lot of the most impactful CFOs that I work with in our growth stage portfolio at IVP today are ones that really have outsized disruptive and strategic impact at the companies that they're part of. And so a lot of the candidates that we met were a little more kind of traditional in their orientation as CFOs. And that's not what our executive team and board was looking for and excited about. That was probably one reason. The second, on the flip side, was me and the finance organization internally at Dropbox were almost solely focused on helping to inflect the business and on driving disruptive strategic impact internally. That's just naturally where I gravitated, and a lot of the early hires that I made into the finance organization gravitated. And so the project that we talked about where we spent hundreds of millions of dollars to double gross margins, there were other examples like that as a private company on the efficiency side, on the growth side, where we pushed really, really hard to change the way that we operated to realize our full potential as a company. I think those projects and examples probably, stood out to our founder and CEO, Drew, and to the board. And so I think the bet was ultimately made on, hey, Ajay is relatively inexperienced. He'd be a first-time CFO, a first-time, to your point, soon to be public company CFO, but impact and trajectory with the right mentorship, we think he can get there. That's a bet that was ultimately made, but it wasn't made without risk for sure. And I remember talking to our founder and CEO, Drew, when we were discussing me stepping into the CFO role, and him saying, I fully expect us to have some scraped knees as a result of putting you in this, if you accept as a result of putting you in this role. But I think that the upside to the company is going to be much higher at the end of the day. And so it's a risky bet, but a bet that I really want to make, is what he told me.
And how much of it came down to the trust that Drew had and the relationship that you had already built for, I think at that point, 4 years, right, before you got offered the
That's right.
role. How much of that played a part in your opinion?
Huge part. That's why I was offered the opportunity, was trust in the relationship and the track record internally. And it was with Drew, our founder and CEO. It's also with our board, and we had a couple of former CFOs on our board. That was the other huge thing for me. And this relates to the topic of mentorship. We had 2 former public company CFOs on our board who were amazing mentors to me, who were both of that strategic orientation as CFOs. So one was Bob Mylod, and he was the former president and CFO of Priceline, which is now Booking.com, and helped to lead their turnaround as a company and scale up into a very successful organization today. And the other was Don Blair, who was the former CFO of Nike, the consumer products company that we all know and love. And the 2 of them kind of talked to Drew about, hey, like if we make this bet on Ajay, we're both going to sign up to really be mentors to him and to help shepherd him through the process of getting ready to go public, taking Dropbox public, operating successfully as a public company, team building and all the right rhythms, and they certainly lived up to their commitment and promise there. And so I would say it was Drew seeing a lot of potential and having the chemistry and relationship with him and wanting to make that bet, and then some really great mentors on the board willing to raise their hand and step up and partner very closely with me from that point forward.
Got it. And I'll come back to the, some of the challenges of being a public company CFO, but on this thread of mentorship, clearly you had awesome ones, as you took over as CFO and you had their support. And now that you're on the other side of the table, you sit on boards, you've had that experience, you've been a public company CFO. How has your perspective changed? How do you go about, the mentorship path for maybe the people that you are helping, right?
That is such a good question. And honestly, that's why I made the jump back to this side of the table. It's really to be in deep and impactful partnership with the next generation of consequential companies and their executive teams, their founders, their CFOs. I spent a lot of time with the CFOs across my portfolio and our portfolio as a firm because it's just an area of passion for me. And I try to give back in little ways, in the way that people gave back to me, honestly. And I've yet to work with a company personally through the IPO process that I've helped us invest in. One of my first investments at IVP was in Figma as part of their Series E round, and Figma just announced their acquisition by Adobe, which is such a great outcome for the company and for Adobe. But it'll have to be the next one that I partner with for an IPO. Yeah, exactly, exactly. But yes, to answer your question, I try to give back in the same way that people gave to me when I was in the CFO role, and that's why I'm in the job I'm in today.
All right. And so as you look at your own qualities that ultimately led you to get the trust and the CFO role, and as you see the people that you mentor, what are some of the patterns that you see typically that says, you know what, this person can go the distance, right? So this person has what it takes, because, as with all kind of roles, and a CFO role is kind of one of them. It's like a pyramid, right? And the top job, there's just few of them, right? It's not as easy for everybody to get there. And what are some of the qualities you see in people that you mentor that makes you feel, okay, this person has what it takes to go the distance?
Yeah, another really good question. I would say, like, if I had to boil it down to two distinctive qualities, because there's obviously so much that goes into making a great CFO. And so many folks that I've had the opportunity to work with across my career have made incredible CFOs much better than me and are going off to accomplish a lot more than me. And so, like, being able to run the nuts and bolts of finance organization, having context, being great at recruiting, like, there's so much that goes into it. But if I had to boil it down, I would say the two distinctive qualities: passion is the first one, which people don't always think about passion in relation to the CFO community, and impact orientation, passion and impact, to make it even simpler. And so passion, are they passionate about what their company is doing, about the product they're bringing to market, about their customers, about their organization, team culture? Are they bringing kind of a tangible, infectious passion and energy to what they do every day? I look for that, because the CFO obviously has to manage and inspire her or his own organization, but they're oftentimes, unbeknownst to folks before stepping in the role, they end up becoming a really important internal spokesperson and champion about company strategy and why we're making the decisions that we are and where we're headed. A lot of that falls on the CFO's shoulders. It did on mine at Dropbox. And once you start going through that process of going public, if you're fundraising, this is the case, but once you work through an IPO and you're a public company, the bulk of that spokesperson responsibility externally will fall on the CFO's shoulders. And so, are they someone that brings genuine passion to what they do? And are they great at communicating that passion? And then the second is impact orientation. It's a lot to manage a finance organization and company at scale. And that job in and of itself is what most CFOs do. That can take up 100% of your time. But is this someone who's really focused on going above and beyond and having disruptive impact as part of the company or the organization that they're at? So if I see those two things, like a tremendous amount of passion and this natural orientation towards disruptive impact, then there's like other smaller signals that I'll look for, but like those tend to be, make a pretty promising candidate for CFO.
Got it. And going back to your experience as a public company CFO, were there any holy shit, what did I do? I may be in over my head here moments, especially in those early days after Dropbox went public?
We spent a lot of time preparing for our IPO, and I, by virtue of being a first-time CFO and first-time soon-to-be public company CFO, I really had to hire an amazing team around me of people who had more experience than me and who were honestly more deserving to be CFO than me, but excited to partner with me to take Dropbox public. And so I had such an awesome team operationally that we didn't really hit any big hiccups on the path to going public and in our first few quarters as a public company. Like many public companies, both internet and software companies, you certainly have your moments when you're really pushing hard to make your numbers, to hit your numbers and guidance. And so we had a few of those. And I think one really interesting reflection and lesson learned from that, I remember you end up as a public company for those that have joined us today, guiding to a relatively small set of metrics and numbers. So you'll guide to GAAP revenue, and you'll guide to operating income, you'll guide to free cash flow, which we did as a software company. But you kind of limit the set of formal metrics that you provide guidance for. And then the analyst community and the buy side community will infer implicit guidance on a number of other metrics. So they'll say, oh, if you're guiding to that revenue number, then you're probably going to grow your subscribers by X, and your paid products by Y, and your average revenue per user by Z. And so there are a number of shadow metrics that you end up having to manage to, in addition to the formal metrics that you guide to. So I remember one quarter we were not on track to hit one of our shadow metrics as a public company. And we wanted to make sure, as we established credibility as a newly public company with a relatively young management team, that we continued to really credibly beat and raise every quarter across the board. And so we assembled a SWAT team to kind of run this down and understand what levers we had to really hit our numbers. And we had a couple of levers, and we had teams staffed against it. And we ultimately got there, and we made the quarter on every dimension. What that illuminated for me, though, is the power that you have as a CFO as you make that transition from private to public. You wield almost too much power within the organization, because everyone wants to make sure that they have a successful IPO. Everyone wants to make sure that they hit the quarter. And so you can inadvertently draw the organization into a short-term orientation in a way that is difficult to comprehend at the time. And so I was warned about this countless times, Ajay. Like, the one thing to look out for when you take Dropbox public and you're a CFO is, like, make sure you don't fall victim to the gravity well of the quarterly earnings cycle. And I remember being asked, as we embarked on the IPO process, by one of our largest public market shareholders, hey, Ajay, what's like the one thing you're worried about going through this process? I said, oh, the one thing I'm worried about is, falling prey to the quarterly earnings cycle and over-rotating on the short term at the expense of the long term. But it's so top of mind, I'm never going to let it happen. Well, one quarter into being a public company, it happened. And then it's too tempting to try and, put that polish on everything for the next quarter. And it absolutely has a cost and pulls a lot of the organization and, your greatest minds against extending the platform for the long term and investing in what probably really matters.
And speaking of the role of the finance team and sometimes how it can play an outsized impact in the organization, let's talk about an example of just moments of uncertainty, right? So CFOs have to make, like, sometimes very consequential, important decisions with imperfect data, right? And you're kind of grappling through that uncertainty. Does any of those kind of important decisions come to mind from your tenure at Dropbox? What is the situation? Were there any alternatives that you considered as you were making the decision? And where did you end up? I'm thinking about, hopefully people can take away some lessons in terms of the thought process of how you approached it and what you learned from that experience, right?
Yes, many moments of uncertainty. I would think every CFO has some level of uncertainty when they issue guidance every year, annual guidance. So you close out your fiscal year, you report on the results in the year that you delivered, and then you issue guidance for the year ahead. And in that process of issuing guidance, it's a delicate balance of guiding to what you have visibility into, but also guiding towards the aspiration and the potential that your company has for the year. And so sometimes you may have a bulletproof plan that you feel, great about with 100% confidence to hit the guidance that you put out there. Many times you're not going to have that. And so there's inherent uncertainty in issuing aspirational guidance to push your organization to achieve its potential. That is there's going to be inherent uncertainty. If there's not, then I do question whether you're really pushing your organization to its max and your team is really achieving everything that it can. And so we certainly have those moments of, here's the revenue guidance that we're going to put out there publicly, and now it's written in stone, and now we have to find a way to hit it. And then it became about, how are we going to hit that number? And we took it really seriously as a finance organization. We wouldn't put a number out there and then, pass the ball internally to a different organization. Then we tried to lead the process to make sure that we laddered up all of our growth initiatives organically, all of our pipeline inorganically, and from a corp dev M&A standpoint, and we executed against those to make sure that we hit the number over the course of the year. And so I remember one year we issued a number. We had a natural gap that we felt like we could close over time just through strength of execution and talent we had. We ended up taking the burden on our shoulders as a finance organization that year, the brunt of it, to go off source, make an acquisition. We acquired a company called HelloSign, which is in the e-signature and document workflow space. It's a competitor to DocuSign for SMBs. And they had a really impressive growth rate that accelerated through some of the synergies, the revenue synergies that we realized together. And then we were able to close that revenue gap. And so I would say that was the ongoing uncertainty of annual revenue guidance was definitely a source of stress, but also operational improvement for us every year.
And so we talked about the relationship of trust between the CFO and the CEO, obviously super important. Talk to me a little bit about how you approach the relationship with the other members of the leadership team, the executive team. In a lot of cases, it's definitely not a reporting relationship, but you have to bring influence to bear to kind of make sure that, from a financial discipline perspective and a whole lot of other areas, that you're influencing the organization to move in the right way without actually having a reporting relationship with certain people, right? So how did you approach that aspect of your job of building those relationships, making sure that the plan that you had come up with ultimately was one every area of the company was executing against?
Yeah. I would say that the role of the CFO gives you a little bit of an unfair advantage from my perspective on that dimension, because you're running the annual planning process. In many cases, you're running the multi-year planning process and managing that. You're working through your quarterly reforecast as you get ready to go public and as a public company. And working through those processes requires just the maintenance of so many cross-functional touch points and relationships that you're always in dialogue with every part of the organization to understand where top line's trending, to understand where gross margins are trending, to understand where OpEx and spend is trending and where you have levers and where you don't. And you're exercising influence to pull those levers relatively often, and you're building that influence over time. And so that credibility influence certainly took years to build as an organization and for me personally. And then we were able to leverage that in the ways that we needed as a public company. It took a lot of maintenance too, and from a relationship perspective and camaraderie standpoint and culturally, but we took culture pretty seriously and invested quite a bit in it.
Yeah, Jay, I think we lost your audio for some reason. I think you might have disconnected from your AirPods.
Oh, can you hear me now?
You're back. Yes. Let's go.
Okay, good. I was saying that we invested a lot culturally as an organization at Dropbox. And so we took team and culture super seriously. And so we were always finding ways to develop more camaraderie and trust with one another. One thing we did as an executive team, which I think helped tremendously, is we all worked with executive coaches. And those coaches all worked together behind the scenes. So it was this process called symmetric coaching, which I'm sure you're familiar with too, but it was one coaching firm. We were each assigned an individual coach, and the coaching firm did a lot of work behind the scenes to understand where there were potential relationship issues or friction points and how to unblock those. And they worked individually with executive team members to help us function better as a company. So that helped tremendously. And then I would say pursuing excellence. We were an organization at Dropbox known for pursuing excellence and for not settling for anything but the best, and for always pushing ourselves and everyone around us harder. And once we developed that reputation, there was just a lot of inherent trust with people that you partner with, because they knew that they were going to partner with someone who had the company's best interest in mind and who was going to push them to achieve their full potential. So I think that culture of excellence and the pursuit of excellence really paid off for us too.
All right, that's awesome. So I'm going to shift to getting your thoughts on the future a little bit. But for all of the folks listening in, if you have questions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Start please putting them in there. I will get to questions in a few minutes, and looking forward to kind of having Ajay's thoughts on some of your questions. So now going back to the role that you're in now, right? So you're back to being an investor. Clearly, part of the job is to try and look at the future through the crystal ball and make investments. How are you kind of thinking about, say, the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to, I know you invest in lots of stuff, but at least when it comes to office of the CFO tools and software and products, and what are your thoughts on where it's going and how the role of the CFO itself is evolving, right?
Yeah. Well, I would say the office of the CFO is certainly a strategic investment area that's near and dear to my heart as a former CFO. It's an area where I spend a lot of time. There's like this category thesis in general that we have as a firm, the level of innovation we've seen for the front office. So think next generation CRM tools and the pioneering influence that a company like Salesforce had, or marketing automation software. Any kind of tooling related to the front office or top line has seen a tremendous amount of innovation and investment over the last 10 to 20 years. We have not seen that for the traditional back office functions like finance or people or legal. And I think we're in the early innings of beginning to see that. And if you think about the tooling that the traditional office of the CFO uses, they're running on NetSuite or Oracle or SAP from an ERP standpoint. They're running on Adaptive or Anaplan, or again, a module from SAP or Oracle for financial planning. So these are all tools that in large part were designed 20 years ago and have really been very marginally improved since then. And there's a really interesting wave of innovation now happening across both accounting and FP&A, next generation accounting and FP&A software. And we're actively looking at all the companies in those categories. We actually just made an investment in a company in one of those categories that will be announced. My comms and marketing team will kill me if I announce it right now, but it will be announced, I hope in the next 2 weeks is our target there, if not shortly thereafter. But it's an awesome next generation financial planning platform that allows you to do things that you could never do before as a CFO. And so think like real-time scenario analysis and kind of, that real-time organizational agility you want to steer in a different direction or understand what's working or what isn't working or change resourcing across the organization. It's a tool that allows you to do things like that. And so like that's the kind of stuff that like I get personally very passionate about, and that we're seeing, I think, a wave of innovation around. That's one category. The other category I spent a lot of time in, I would say it's like the broader productivity and collaboration category. As a former executive at a productivity and collaboration company at Dropbox. And there, as we've all experienced, there have been so many changes to the way that we work over the past two and a half years. And I think we're still in the very early innings of understanding how the world's going to work going forward, how the professional world is going to work going forward. Yep. And there's some really interesting companies that have cropped up to just help manage hybrid teams, remote teams, company communication, culture, engagement, and there's some exciting stuff there as well that we're pretty focused on.
Got it. So before I move on, a couple of higher level questions. What is the best advice that you've gotten in your career so far? Maybe a hard question, but does anything stand out?
The best advice, there are two pieces of advice that stand out to me thinking about this one. One is always optimize for team. And I mentioned early on in my career, I joined a kind of a non-traditional group in investment banking, the power and utilities group that worked with like PG&E and companies like that. But it was the best decision that I made early on in my career because I worked with an incredible team that took my career development super seriously and ended up facilitating a transition to the world of tech for me over time, which was incredible. Same thing with Dropbox. It was me really taking a bet on a team. It was a platform that had a lot of momentum, but a team that I thought was incredible with an awesome culture and energy. Because I stepped into an undefined role, kind of leaving this career track investing position in an awesome fund to step into an undefined role at a somewhat unproven startup. But the team was incredible. And again, it was probably the best career decision of my life to do that. And so that advice I got early on in my career, and it's just rung true every single transition I've made in my career. The second one, I would say, and I mentioned this briefly as well, in terms of our reputation as an organization within Dropbox, is kind of pursuit of excellence, regardless of what it is you're doing. And for individuals and organizations that are in active pursuit of excellence, I've just found like they have limitless potential and impact. So whether you're the legal org or the finance org or the product organization, that pursuit of always up leveling and pursuing excellence, I think it pays off so much, and so many dividends. And so I think team and pursuit of excellence, and if you can adhere to those two principles, then I think it's going to be hard not to be successful.
Fantastic. No, that's incredible. I'm going to jump to some of the audience questions. Greg is asking, hey, he read somewhere that you attributed some of your success to embedding FP&A folks throughout the organization. And is that true? And if so, what was the driving force that began that initiative, right?
Yeah, so we certainly embedded FP&A. The precursor to really almost every team we built in the finance organization at Dropbox was this team called Strategic Finance. It was like a very generic label we put. So we had, when I first joined the company, we had a couple of people in accounting and finance operations, like 2 people, and that was about it. And so we had the accounting team where there's really specific expertise that you need, and then the strategic finance team, which helped manage FP&A and our early tax strategy and real estate and the leases I mentioned, built our first company model, et cetera. So then that strategic finance team, we, from the very early days, embedded across different parts of the organization. So we had someone from strategic finance dedicated to our infrastructure team, which led to the development of that initiative to migrate off of Amazon. We had someone from strategic finance embedded with the product organization, which led to the pursuit of really interesting acquisitions. And so I think the business partnership and the thought partnership that unlocked for us was really powerful. And then as we built out a more traditional FP&A organization, we had a little bit less of a centralized FP&A focus, where the team was spending all day, every day together, but much more of the decentralized approach to FP&A, where I would say our FP&A leads were closer to the operating teams they worked with than they were probably to one another or to the finance organization. But that just gave us tremendous insight and influence across the company.
Got it. And so Krishna has a question about tooling. When did you decide to shift your operating model from Excel to a planning reporting system? And how did you think about the trade-off between maintaining speed and flexibility that Excel provides versus maybe the power of a heavier system?
So this is the entirety of my thesis behind the investment that I just made, because we never got off Excel. I'll be honest. Okay. We never got entirely off of Excel. So many company models, everyone's first company model surely is built on Excel, and so many company models are maintained in Excel. When we went public, our operating model and our guidance model was maintained in Excel. When we issued guidance as a public company, that was out of Excel. When we updated our quarterly outlook, that was in Excel. And it's not by virtue of us trying to implement one of the larger planning tools out there or the incumbent planning tools out there. So as a private company, we evaluated, the first planning tool that we evaluated and implemented was SAP BPC. We had someone in our FP&A organization at the time who was familiar with the tool from a prior role, advocated for it, implemented it, ended up being a failed implementation, a really clunky, difficult to use, expensive system of record is how I would describe it. So we would use it to lock our annual plan and our quarterly reforecast. So we had a reference point to understand what we actually said we were going to do, that had all the right access permissioning so people couldn't change it. But outside of that, it didn't do much else for us. Then as we got ready to go public, we migrated off of NetSuite onto Oracle for ERP, and we implemented Oracle's financial planning module, PBCS, which ended up being effectively the same thing, a very expensive system of record for us, because the level, as as the questioner noted, the level of agility that you have in Excel just was light years ahead of what you could do in Oracle's tooling. And so again, I would say that was a failed implementation. And then we evaluated Adaptive and Anaplan, but they were going to be 9 to 12 month implementation cycles and be relatively clunky tools, inflexible logic. So if you want to make a logic change, if you want to add a new SKU or a new product into your plan in Anaplan, for example, you need a system administrator to go in there and make some of those changes, and that can take days or a week plus to make. And so if you think about a really high IQ, high bandwidth finance organization and FP&A team that's like trying to be in lockstep with their product organization and making changes to the funnel and acquisitions and new products, and they can't be doing that in minutes, then that's a big issue. There's one company that solved that out there today. And again, you'll hear more in a couple of weeks on who that company is, but super promising company with a lot of enterprise traction out of the gates because people need that kind of tooling.
All right, that's fantastic. And the lesson here is that you can take a company public on Excel, right? And so
that's not, I would say most companies probably go public on Excel, whether or not they like to admit it.
Got it. That's awesome. So, one more question. As when you're thinking of it as an investor now, and you're working with a founder, a CEO who is not from a finance background, how do you advise them on what profile of CFO is right for them? One with an investment banking background or coming up from the accounting kind of background. How do you think about that choice based on the business, and how do you typically advise CEOs you work with?
So I think folks from both kinds of backgrounds can be very successful. So when I transitioned from Dropbox, I passed the reins to our chief accounting officer, who was the first hire I made as CFO, and extraordinarily capable, doing a great job as CFO at Dropbox. And he was the right person to take the reins at the time. And then I've had folks in our FP&A organization to talk a bit about the Dropbox alumni group and give folks a sense. So we have the current CFOs of companies like Figma, we mentioned, alumni of the Dropbox Strategic Finance and FP&A org. So Figma, Plaid, OpenAI, Stripe, Anrock, Pilot, Komodo Health, Department List. The CFOs of all these companies or VPs of finance, that's at a couple, we're all folks that kind of graduated from that organization. So I think, and some started in FP&A, some started in accounting. And so I've seen both profiles be really, really successful. What I look for, it really depends on the stage of the company that we're investing in, honestly. We are a growth stage venture firm, but that's a pretty wide remit. And so the earliest stage companies I've invested in since joining have been generating 5 to 10 million of ARR. And the larger companies I've had the pleasure of investing in have been generating 150, 200 million of ARR. So that's a pretty wide range, and it's a different kind of profile that you kind of look for. What I do, which is probably not scalable infinitely, is I personally help lead the CFO or VP of finance search at the companies that I work with. And I spend a lot of time in relationship and mentorship with the folks in that role. And that helps me feel good about who we're placing. And there's a lot of trust that I get from our founders and CEOs to do that, just given my background. So that's my cheat code today, but we'll see. Yeah. We'll see how I have to evolve that going forward.
So once you're on a dozen boards, the thinking we have to evolve a bit. But so I can validate, our FP&A lead at Airbase is a Dropbox alum, so I can vouch for the quality of the team that Ajay built. And awesome. So I'm going to end with a couple of fun questions, and then we can wrap up. This has been amazing. You are incredibly busy. A lot of demands on your time, but what do you do to relax and when you're not working, right? And how do you spend your time when you're not in front of a computer or trying to convince the next hot company to take your money?
Yes. What do I do? So I have 2 young daughters who are 5 and 2. And so I spend most of my free time with them. We build a lot of Legos together, which is a ton of fun. And I am I'm an amateur, but avid runner. And so I run a lot. I live on the peninsula just south of San Francisco. So I run a lot in the hills in the peninsula. So if anyone's ever interested in a hill run, I would love to do that with you. And so that's probably where most of my time goes into family time and running, honestly, outside of work.
Last question. Are you reading any book now, or did you finish one recently that you can recommend to all of us?
Okay, interesting. I'm going to go in a non-traditional way with this one. So again, with young children, Mostly, I'll be honest, mostly children's books nowadays. What's a great children's book that we read recently? Well, we're approaching Halloween, and there's a book called Spooky Pooky. Spooky Pooky, Pooky. If you haven't read it, it's actually a pretty fun read.
That's awesome. My wife is currently reading a book about negotiating with difficult toddlers, and I forget the name of the book. And she tells me it's good. I haven't started reading it yet. I will send over the recommendation to you. And Ajay, this was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure everyone who kind of joined us did also. I will now hand it back to Mackenzie.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Thejo and Ajay. We really appreciate your time. And for anybody who is interested in learning more about Airbase, I will submit and open a poll. You can answer as honestly as you'd feel. But again, Ajay and Thejo, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Bye.